Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the planet. Welcome to the third webinar in the Linked Early Modern Drama online training series. This is our June technical webinar. We have two presentations today. The first by me is about LEMDO's sustainability plan. Then Navarra Holden, our project manager, will speak about making accessible editions. Your attendance today counts as a credit towards the Canadian Certificate in Digital Humanities program started by Laura Estelle at St. Francis Xavier University. Thank you, Laura. This webinar is funded by a connection grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Thank you, SSHRC. My name is Janelle Jenstad. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor in the Department of English at the University of Victoria, where I teach Shakespeare, early modern drama, book history, and digital humanities. I'm the conceptor and director of LEMDO, and I'm also the academic director of the Humanities Computing and Media Center at UVic. With my colleagues in HCMC, I helped to start the Endings Project, which has changed how we build websites and is starting to change how other people build websites as well. At UVic, we like to begin presentations in a good way by recognizing the land on which we live and work. We therefore acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wet'suwet'en peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. This month is our Equity, Diversity, and Accessibility Month. We have later in June an editorial webinar, which will feature talks by Brandy Adams on editing early modern drama and race, and by Amrita Sen on LEMDO and in the Global South. Mark Caitler, who is coordinating editor of the Moemal Mayoral Shows Anthology, will chair that session. So please watch for sign-up links if you haven't already signed up. We have 4 learning objectives for this first presentation today. First, you'll know why sustainability is an equity issue in digital editing. Second, you will know what endings compliance means. Third, you will know why endings compliance matters and how it facilitates digital sustainability, archivability, and longevity. And fourth, you will know how LEMDO makes its endings compliant editions and anthologies. So do please feel free to ask questions as we go, either in the chat, which Navarra will monitor while I'm speaking, and I will monitor while they are speaking, or by raising your virtual hand. And we'll also have a bit of time at the end to take questions. Okay, so digital sustainability. Let's get started with our first learning objective. What is digital sustainability? Is it possible to sustain a digital edition as long as a print edition? We might not be able to preserve them even to eternity, but LEMDO's technologies give our digital editions a very long shelf life. A lot of people have been worrying about a digital dark age. By that, we mean the potential for a massive loss of born digital materials that were built with rapidly obsolete technologies. And it is true that lots of really valuable scholarly websites have disappeared or become unusable. You, like me, might have relied on the Shakespeare Quartos archive, for example. It was generously funded, sponsored by major libraries like the Folger Shakespeare Library and hosted by the venerable Bodleian Library. And yet the resource was withdrawn after 11 years. And I quote from their website, "The technologies with which it is built have reached end of life." And you can look at it at the Wayback Machine, but it's not updatable and it's not being maintained anymore. You might also be painfully aware that the British Library had a cybersecurity attack in the autumn, and a lot of the resources that we rely on daily in our teaching and research practice became unavailable. If you go looking for those same quartos on the British Library's Treasures in Full website, you'll get a "sorry, we can't find that page" message. 10 months after the attack on the British Library servers, many resources that I and others use regularly in our classrooms are still not available. And of course, our own predecessor project, the Internet Shakespeare Editions, lost its server in 2018. While my good colleagues in the Humanities Computing and Media Center were able to rescue many pages from the project and staticize them, there is no longer a backend server, meaning that we cannot easily correct the broken link here. So if you're trying to work with Time of Athens, you will get to a couple of no image available screens. So there are pretty big consequences to this digital failure. First of all, there's the loss of a useful resource that people have come to rely on, particularly in places without easy access to major libraries. There are broken links across the internet and in the footnotes of people's articles. It's a waste of public funds. It's a loss of scholars and students and developers, intellectual labor, time, expertise. And that leads to mistrust of digital scholarship and devaluing of the medium. And it hurts the open access movement, which is really important to equitable access to resources around the world, especially in places that don't have funding for textbooks, aren't close to libraries, don't provide travel money. And of course, that applies especially to the Global South, scholars and students in the Global South, to people who aren't able to travel for family reasons or mobility reasons. So digital failure is actually an ethical issue. And my particular little corner of that is my deep concern that people will contribute work to the project and then have it disappear before their careers are over. So that's what we're aiming to avoid. So given what has happened to other websites, it's understandable that editors might have worries. How long will my work last? Can I add it to my tenure or promotion dossier? Will people cite my work? Those are the things that I'm concerned about on your behalf, especially because we have these bigger aims of increasing the number of editors overall. Editing should no longer be the purview of a small group of privileged people. We want anybody who wants to edit to have that opportunity. We want to support early career editors. We're interested in increasing the diversity of editors and developing new ways of sharing editorial labor. So given those goals, it's important to preserve your work. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the mechanisms that we've put in place to make your work preservable. So let's move on to our second learning outcome, endings compliance. Before I explain what I mean by endings compliance, I'm just going to explain briefly why sites like the Shakespeare Quartos archive sometimes fail. They're usually built with a fairly complicated software stack. And in order to access what we think of as a page in that website, we're making a request to our browser, which in turn relays a request. So this diagram was not drawn by me, it was drawn by my colleague Martin Holmes, but it's an attempt to give a simplified version of a very complicated process. If it looks complicated, imagine that it's actually 100 times more complicated. When you see horses, imagine 100 horses. Or when we talk of horses, imagine 100 horses. So you make a request from your browser, usually a URL, and that'll pass that request along to, say, an Apache server in this case, and then to another type of server called Tomcat, and then to a third type of server called Cocoon. And it will make a query to an exist database. It will use a language called XQuery to go and query the XML collection. It will go and get the content from the page. It will get the images. It will get the footer and the header and the credits, and it'll bundle them all together and send an XML page back to Cocoon, which then runs XSLT to turn it into XHTML. That's the page that you thought you were getting all along. And then finally, it gets relayed back to your desk as a page. And if you're lucky, that happens almost instantaneously and you don't even know all the things that have to happen along the way. But there are lots of points of failure in that process. So, you know, if anything fails anywhere along the way, any of these kind of waypoints in the process, or the server that makes the pages, or the backend exists database, it won't be possible to deliver your page to you. Also, there's only one place where you can get that page, and it's from the site that's hosting the server, where the server lives. So I liken that process to having to build a Gutenberg-style press every time you want to read an early modern book. Can you imagine if we had to do that? You know, it would be an enormously laborious process, and it would be prohibitively expensive. And yet, we still can read books from the Gutenberg era, even though not a single Gutenberg press actually survives. So project endings emerged from this concern about that particular model of building websites. So we were a group of 9 people that was led by the Humanities Computing and Media Center. There were 3 editors, including me, 3 librarians, and 3 developers. And we set out with this goal to prevent a digital dark age. We asked a question about how we could work together to develop protocols that would make it possible for websites to be easily archived in libraries at the end of their life. You can read more about it if you go to the Endings Project website, and here's the link to it, and I'll also include it in the final resources slide. So Endings came up with a number of recommendations, 5 different categories of principles, each one with 5 or 6 sub-principles. So I've just picked out the ones that are most important for us at LEMDO. So Endings recommended that a project have no dependence on server-side software. So there should be no process whereby pages get made on the fly. They should all be pre-made and ready to read. We also recommended no dependence on external code libraries or services. So that minimizes the number of things that can go wrong along the way when people ask for a web page. We called for no boutique or fashionable technologies in the way that a website was output. So our websites are just HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS, cascading style sheets. Those are the founding languages of the internet. A site built in those from the 1990s is still usable, whereas sites that were built with boutique technologies in the 2010s might not be available anymore. We also called for no dependence on an internet connection, which seems a bit counterintuitive. How can I view a web resource without an internet connection? I'll explain that in a minute or two. And our idea of a perfect website is a folder full of HTML pages, each of them self-contained and capable of working on its own. So we wanted to get away from this complicated model here and go to this model, which is what a lot of people thought they were getting all along. Now we're actually doing it. So if you make a request from your web browser, we'll send back a pre-made page. And it's fairly quick and it's fairly lightweight, which is also good for the environment. So the environmental cost of an endings compliant website is quite a bit lower than a website that is constantly generating pages on the fly and then serving them up to you. Okay, I'm not seeing hands. Are there any questions so far? All right, we'll move on. So our third objective today was to explain to you how we make editions and anthologies. So I'm going to go through the various phases of making an edition. In the working stage of editing, our editors or the anthology leads on behalf of the editors are committing their new work to a versioned repository. And what that means is that we keep every version of every file. And so while you might overwrite your own work in your local file, we always keep a copy of the latest file that or every version of the file that you've committed. And we can roll back any file to an earlier version. So if you accidentally deleted, 4 months work, we'd say, no problem. We'll just restore the page to yesterday's status and you can pick up from there. It keeps your work safe. It also means we can all work in the same repository. You don't have to worry about other people going into your files. In the unlikely event that that were to happen, we would be able to roll back to an earlier version. Usually editors have access and the right to commit only to their own edition portfolio. So usually you're pretty safe. In the building phase of the project, we're using something called a continuous integration server. So we don't wait for someone to request a file. We build all of our files into HTML pages when we make a commit to this local versioned repository. So we're constantly building our site. And the continuous integration server that we're using is called Jenkins. There are other ones available. The icon for Jenkins is this picture of a butler. And that's kind of like, that's pretty much what he does. He buttles around and gathers up all the XML files and dusts them and makes them look nice. And the way we've set up our Jenkins is that it takes those HTML pages that Mr. Jenkins makes from the XML and it bundles them into anthologies. So you can see on the screen here that these are the artifacts of our build process, build number 1032 as it happens, and you can see all of the anthologies here on the screen. DUA, which Ada worked on, DRD, DRE, EMDP, and so on. And I meant to highlight the DRE one, but my red box has moved on the screen. So we can view those anthologies that get built every day, sometimes a couple times a day, but they're not yet publishable. So it's a safe space for us to flail about and see our work. In the proofing phase, when you're ready to have a look at what you've done, you can go to the LEMDO development site, LEMDO Dev, where everyone can view their work. We also, once the anthologies are ready to start building an anthology with additions, we're spinning out a DRE beta site every day, a QME beta site every day, MOML mayoral shows beta site every day, and so on. And you can read that in its HTML format and see how your work looks. Sometimes it's easier to see typos when you can read the HTML over the XML. And then we'll talk a lot more in April about this particular publishing model, but I'll just give you a heads up now that we use a release model. So, your work doesn't go live until it's ready to go. And there's a release that is well-timed for your work. So every anthology will work towards a release date. We set deliverables for that release date. We give hard deadlines to editors and coordinating editors. Got to get your stuff in because basically we're going to press. We set a free freeze period of 2 months, I think, Navarra.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And then we set a freeze date, and when the freeze date rolls around, there's no more substantive work on any files. You can look at them in the HTML. If you notice a typo, we'll correct it. But basically, we're in the last days before we release the anthology. So let me explain what it means to release an anthology from the technical side of things. So let's take the Mom's Anthology, MOML Mayoral Shows Anthology as an example. And Mr. Jenkins is going to build a new site every time somebody commits a file that belongs in the Mom's Anthology. Just to simplify it, I'm going to imagine that Mr. Jenkins is going to build the site 12 times, once a day. So on day one, we'll add a file and it will build us a new site, which is a collection of HTML pages in a big folder. On day two, we correct the metadata and it builds us a new site. On day three, we are checking for typos. On day four, we're entering those typos, typo corrections. and so on, until we get to the point where what we're seeing on the beta site is what we want the world to see. And then we pull all those files down into a separate folder in a separate place, and we post them to this generic URL. Once we do that, it sits there until the next time we do a release. It doesn't change. We also archive all of these. So, you know, when we first released the Mom's Anthology, it had just 2 editions in it. There are 32 editions that projected in total. We have people working actively on about 10 of them right now, and some people who are going to loop back and do a second one after they finish their first one. So we're going to be releasing this Mom's Anthology a number of times. And we may correct things in earlier editions if we notice something that needs to be corrected. But we don't overwrite any of those releases. We keep them and we give them a canonical URL and we host them here at UVic on an HCMC server, and ultimately they can also be archived in the library. They could be archived in your library. You could have a copy for your own records. You could ask for it on a thumb drive. You could post it to your own server. You know, we can make lots of copies. So the benefits of that particular model are that we're building websites that have book-like qualities. Books are a really great information storage technology. And we know that lots of copies of books helps to keep them safe. We know there have been losses of books from the early modern period, but if there's even one copy, we can still access that. And the likelihood of a work, a text surviving goes up with the number of copies that have survived. So we know that lots of copies keep stuff safe. That is a phrase that was developed at Stanford. We've adapted it slightly to say lots of static copies keep stuff safe. We don't want dynamic copies of websites. We want static copies of websites. And I pronounce that lost keys. So what do I mean by copies? So a copy of one of our anthologies, I like to think of the internet accessible copy at a UVic URL as being a bit like a library book. You know, lots of people can use that book. But you can also have your own copy of that folder full of HTML files on a thumb drive, on a hard drive, or on your own server, as I said. And we actually encourage that. There has been a tendency in the past to want to drive people to the URL where you're counting the number of users and figuring out where they're coming from and which pages they're looking at. You know, I understand that desire to collect metrics, but we actually think that the desire for lots of copies in lots of different places is more important than being able to capture metrics on every single user. All right. You know, just as a book has no way of capturing how many people actually read a copy, we're willing to forego that data in order to ensure the longevity of our project. So if we have a quick peek at the back end, this is a screenshot of what Mr. Jenkins makes for us when it builds the Digital Renaissance Editions anthology, which is coming out probably in August. So you can see there's a whole bunch of files. These are the files that make up the website. And I've been using the word flat or static. What I mean by that is that there's no hierarchy in here. You know, it's as deep as a puddle. There's one layer of HTML pages. The fact that those websites are built like that makes them highly crawlable by tools like the Wayback Machine. So we're also relying on the Wayback Machine to crawl these sites from time to time. And because nothing is nested, because everything is at the same flat level, the Wayback Machine is better able to make a list of all the pages. You can also download all the files into a zipped folder, and then you've got it. It's yours. So longevity. We know that these are going to last as long as HTML and JavaScript and cascading style sheets survive. They're the founding languages of the internet. If HTML doesn't work, we have bigger problems on our hands. We won't be worrying about websites. We'll be worried about basic survival. Our sites also work without CSS. So should CSS fail or somebody turn it off on their machine, the site won't look as nice, but it will still work. The content is still readable without JavaScript, but some functionalities will be switched off. So if you turned off JavaScript on your machine, which you can do, things that are currently pop-ups would just be rendered at the bottom of the page like footnotes. Usability is something we can increase with this endings compliance model. Our websites are open access, but they're not necessarily internet dependent. So if we can give you the site on a thumb drive, you could be using it in a classroom where your internet connection is dodgy, or in some place, which is often the case in the global south or in rural areas where you don't have internet at all. It works really nicely on a mobile, and we also have a PDF output, which you can have printed via print on demand, or you can load it up into a learning management system. And it's the same text that is on the open access generic URL. So your students could be reading the text in the learning management system, or they could be reading it online, but everybody's reading the same text. These websites are also easy to cite because they have a publication date, they have a release number, which is like an edition, and they have a permanent archival URL.
Janelle, I'm going to pause you there for a second because we've gotten a question from Laura.
Sure.
When you add a release, will you add a note like see here for the latest release to previous releases?
Yes, we have release notes in every release, and it is my plan. We haven't had an anthology go through a second release yet, but it is my plan in the release notes to give a link to the canonical URL of previous releases.
And I'll also add, as Janelle mentioned, we have the canonical URL for a version of a website, but we also have the generic URL. So moms exists at lemdo.uvic.ca/moms, and that's always going to go to the most recent version, but there's also the canonical URL for a specific version. So we've got it kind of two ways there, which is very lucky.
Yep. Is that a second question from Laura, or a hand still raised?
It's actually just a clarification. So it's great that we'll be adding the notes to go to the previous releases. And Navarra pointed out that the base URL will take you to the most recent one. But I'm wondering, what if someone copied the release 1 URL, and when you go there, would it say see here for the newest release, which would be release 2 or 3?
That is an excellent question, to which I do not have a ready answer. To do that, we would actually have to go into, it would be easy to do. We can just say to see the latest version, and then we'll just give the generic URL, which will always have the latest version. That's a good idea. We'll do it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So a quick recap, and then I'm going to pass over to Navarra. You've learned why some websites fail. It's because they have server-side dependencies. You've learned how to preserve and make our work available for the long term, many copies of static web pages. And you have learned a bit about how endings compliant helps us professionally and increases equity by creating a low-risk publishing model, which is citable and stable. So here's some, the only resource I'm going to share is the Endings website, which I encourage you to share with lots of people. We want everybody to be building websites this way so that they don't fail and people don't experience the heartbreak of losing a project. So please share that. And now I'm going to hand over to Navarra.
Awesome. Thank you, Janelle. Okay, so good morning. It's really nice to see everybody here with us today. I'm going to pick up on a bit of a different topic, but hopefully you'll see some connections, and hopefully you'll also see that this is also important to our LEMDO editions. I'm going to be talking about accessibility. So because we want to ensure that our websites are around for the next 50 years, we also want to ensure that they're accessible to a wide variety of people, including those of us with disabilities. Before we dive in too far, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Navarra. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm currently the project manager and lead trainer with LEMDO. I've been working with the project for about 3 years, and before that, I was really working in the field of accessibility. So I worked as accessibility coordinator with the Victoria Fringe Festival. I've been an accessibility consultant. I've worked in parasport. And so I've kind of existed in the field for a while. That work, along with my own interest in learning about web accessibility, kind of goes alongside my own lived experiences as a disabled person. Outside of work life, I'm an artist. I usually am working with pencil, but I've been exploring with oil paint lately. Lots of fun. So with that said, I'm often fidgeting or doodling while I'm in webinars, and I hope that you feel free to do the same today if you'd like. If you need to be moving around, knitting, typing, making notes, please do. I also want to say thanks to Janelle for her territorial acknowledgement. I know that part of our decolonizing work is recognizing the intersecting systems of oppression that exist in academia and online. And that includes those systems that are making these spaces inaccessible. By making our editions and our websites accessible, we're taking that one small step towards decolonization. And I feel very lucky to be part of that. And I hope that today, as we're taking an intersectional lens, and as we kind of move forward with this, you get to keep that in mind and also experience that. We have a few learning objectives today. The first one is understanding what your positionality is and how that can impact how you edit and you encode. And we're going to specifically be looking in terms of accessibility. So, but positionality does certainly make an impact. We're also going to be looking at the varied needs of your audience members. You're going to get to think about how different readers are accessing your edition and see what you can do to make it easier. We're going to look at some of the ways that we address those needs, both on the LEMDO level and on your edition level, what we do, what you do. And you're going to be familiar with the key principles for writing alt text. So let's get into it. Let's explore our positionalities a little bit. And I like to think of this as why we matter in our editions of early modern drama. First, what is positionality? This is a term that you might have come across before. You might also be new to it. It's okay either way. We'll define it for today, and then we're starting on the same page. Positionality is how we each fit into a space in society. It's relational, so it can shift depending on who we're around, who we're interacting with, and what the situation is. It's also shifting, so we're not always interacting with those same groups, and our circumstances can change. Finally, it's intersectional. That means that no one part of who we are exists separately from all of our other parts. This term intersectionality was coined in the 80s by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a Black woman. She was a legal scholar that really contributed to critical race theory. And that means that lots of these offshoots that we have today, such as pre-modern critical race studies that lots of you might be looking into when you're working on your editions, kind of go back to this original work that she did. When she wrote in her first article on intersectionality, she was talking about legal protections that existed for women were really catering towards white women. And legal protections for Black people were often specifically for Black men. So Black women often were left behind because the legal and academic and activist spaces would focus only on one aspect of their identity and ignore how others compounded or intersected. So we want to make sure we're not doing that today. We're taking this intersectional lens. When we're thinking about positionalities and how we fit into the different contexts of our lives, we are taking that lens. So we're thinking about how things can give us privilege or lead to us being marginalized in society. Things such as our race or our gender or our educational background, whether or not we have a disability, and so on. Those aspects are part of who we are. They make up our social identity. And our positionality comes in when we consider how that social identity matches with our current social context. Who are we interacting with and in what capacity? Within the LEMDO context, we're making additions for students. We recognize that our social identity is going to impact our readers based on our context, which gives us the opportunity to create fuller editions and hopefully be a bit more considerate about what our readers need, and be a little bit more inclusive of those who have been sometimes marginalized in these spaces of early modern drama. Now, when I say this is going to impact our readers' experiences, I'm talking about systems of power and privilege and authority. Sometimes we feel a little bit nervous once we start talking about holding power or having privilege, because there's always that worry that having privilege in one area means that our other lived experience or difficulties are negated. Or even we worry that it means we are the oppressor. That's not what I'm talking about right now. Unless one of you happens to have way more power than I'm giving you credit for, you're not the person causing all of the problems. Now, as I said, our positionality is intersectional and it's dynamic. Holding privilege in one area or multiple areas doesn't mean that we don't experience hardship. It simply means that one part of our identity isn't likely to be the cause of that hardship. It also means we get the opportunity to start breaking down these systems that enforce structural marginalization, which is really awesome. When we're thinking in terms of LEMDO, you have authority through editing and encoding an edition. When you go through the process of editing a play, being part of an anthology, going through peer review, being published, students, which we know are our readers and our audience, they're going to trust what you have to say. You hold that authority. So what you decide to annotate implicitly shows what knowledge is or isn't, valuable in this space and which topics are worthy of study. Similarly, you hold power when you encode. So I went to a webinar earlier this year on accessibility and universal design in digital humanities. It was great. And somebody there phrased it really well. They were talking about alternate text, which we'll talk about later. And they were saying, blind people's access to media online ultimately rests with sighted people and with the sighted people who are adding alternate text and describing images. As encoders, we can decide to add those or not, right? And we can decide to do a good job or not. And hopefully after today, you'll really kind of pick up the mantle to do a great job of this. So going back to kind of our social identity and social context, we're going to join our social identity with our context of student readers. We're not going to do a big positionality exercise today, but I am going to have you think about one particular aspect of this, and that's disability. We're going to look at some accessibility options with LEMDO and with our digital publications. And I'm going to pose some questions to you. You don't need to answer them in the chat because frankly, your answers are really none of my business. But I would like you to kind of consider, do you have a disability? And if you do, does it impact what you consider when you edit or you encode? And if you don't, does that impact what you edit or what you encode? Our lived experience and our social identities can change what we prioritize in our scholarly work, and even just what we're aware of in day-to-day life. If we're not putting in the effort to fill in those gaps, we can accidentally leave out some readers, which of course we don't want to do. To get a bit excited about Shakespeare specifically, did you know there was an adaptation of Hamlet, which I think is still showing in the States right now, in which Horatio was deaf. The play was performed bilingually in English and ASL. This is Prince Hamlet. It focuses on intersectional retelling of Hamlet, and it was put on by Why Not Theatre. Including that in our performance histories of Hamlet gives such a great opportunity for our deaf and hard of hearing audience members to really connect with the editions. It gives us that representation. And so putting in that effort and finding out about these alternate tellings and performances and editorial cruxes really lets us explore our texts in new ways, and it lets us connect with our readers in new ways. Now, what in particular do our student readers need? It depends, of course, on the student. Everybody is going to be looking for something a little bit different, which is why I'm going to recommend that you edit for a third-year class rather than a third-year student, because we've said LEMDOs for third-year English students. Let's think about the class rather than one person. The reason I say this is it encourages us to take multiple positionalities into account. This is opposed to what Kimberly Crenshaw described as a single access framework in her 1989 Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, that seminal work I was talking about earlier. In that, she reminds us that even when we are working to include marginalized groups, we often only include one group or one identity at a time. When we edit for a student, we have the potential to fall into that fallacy. So sure, the student that we imagine might be a member of one marginalized group, but they're not going to be a member of every group. It's just not going to be how that works, which means that there are going to be people who aren't represented in the student that you imagine in your mind. Instead, you might think about a class that you've taught or that you've been a student in. There were probably students of color, disabled students. There was almost certainly more than one gender represented in that class. There were probably some students who really, really loved the topic and just couldn't get enough of it and were answering every question. There were probably also students who were in it to take a credit course because they needed it, and they really didn't care that much or have much background knowledge in the field. All of those people are who we're editing for. That's who's using a LEMDO edition, is a third-year English class. Now, to think specifically about the accessibility needs of those students, there are a few basic things. Everybody is going to need to get some accurate information. They need the website to be functional. It needs to be existent in a year and a half when their teacher tries to link to it. They need the language to be respectful, and they need the information to be laid out clearly. That's the case for everybody. What that looks like can be dependent on the person. So when we're thinking about our readers with disabilities, we can think about some more specific needs. We're looking to ensure that people who use our editions are all getting an equivalent experience out of them, regardless of how they're actually using our LEMDO website. The piece that I'd like to focus on right now is the need for our site to function when accessed with adaptive technologies. Now, if you're new to this idea of adaptive technologies, that's okay. This is where you get to learn a little bit. Some people with disabilities use the internet in different ways, and they access our websites in different ways. For example, somebody who is blind or has a vision impairment might use a piece of technology called a screen reader. They do exactly what's on the label. They read out what's on the screen, and they're actually accessing the HTML to do that. Another example is that for some folks with lower motor function, maybe arthritis in their fingers is a common example. They might choose not to click links with their mouse. Instead, they might tab through those interactive pieces of the site like links with the tab button on their keyboard. And that helps to navigate web pages. Those are two that are pretty common to kind of hear about and see being used. You might be thinking, oh no, I don't know how I deal with that. I don't know how to make it so that somebody can tab through my edition or a screen reader can read what's there. Don't worry. The great news is most of that is dealt with just in HTML. When HTML was created, it was meant to be accessible. And the W3 Consortium has come up with web accessibility guidelines, and they've made sure that the things that they're updating are generally automatically accessible, which is fantastic. LEMDO also gets to play a role in that. So we as a platform have done a few things to make sure that we have good accessibility. And so between our work and the work on the part of the W3 Consortium, a lot of things just are going to work, which is fantastic. Now I'm going to share my screen for a second. Here we go, on my browser. So this is the LEMDO development site. Janelle mentioned earlier on about this. I'm not going to share the link because it's not published, but I will show you what one of our editions, which we have actually already published, looks like on here. So if we go to our editions, I'm going to go to Famous Victories of Henry V. And I'm going to take us to the general introduction. Now here we are on a web page. If I were accessing this with my screen reader, which I've done, I'm not going to do right now because getting it set up takes a minute. But if I were to access it with my screen reader, it would start reading from the top. It would tell me what's the name of this website. It would go through the navigation options. It would tell me that there's a search bar, and then I would move into the main content of the page. It's the same thing if I tab through. So you see this blue line here. This is saying that I've used my keyboard to get to something that's linkable. And I can access any of these if I hit the enter button and tab through and access these options, which is fantastic. If I keep going, it takes a little while. I then get to our actual content itself. And you'll see as I tab, this changes because I'm activating that state as I'm going through with tab. So it's accessible. You can access it with your keyboard, which is really important. And that's been some really clever work on behalf of our programmers to make sure that as we're adding features to make this more like, you know, early modern drama, we're still keeping those accessibility benefits. It's very similar. I'm quite excited about this one. This is a recent change. We've made it so that our annotations, rather than being underlines or vertical lines, are these little icons, which again, you can tab through with a keyboard. You can also click. And we changed this because it gave us a larger clickable area. So for people who are using a mouse, but need a wider space to click, they get that option here. And so that's some of the accessibility features I'm really excited about with LEMDO that just exist automatically. Go back to our slides. There are also some things that are totally in your control when it comes to accessibility. And the one we're really going to dive into right now is alternate text, or alt text for short. If you're unfamiliar with this or maybe need a refresher on what it is, alt text is just text that describes the visual content of media. So it describes what's in an image, essentially. It's what a screen reader reads aloud when it gets to an image on a page. And it also shows up if an image doesn't load on a web page for whatever reason. So let's say your image disappears or it doesn't load because you've got really slow internet. There will be text that shows up in place of your image, and alt text is what that is. It's different from the image caption that we might put underneath an image. So alt text is not always visible, whereas an image caption is. Alt text is a literal description of what's in the image. It doesn't supply anything that's not visible there, whereas image captions might give a discussion of what's being depicted, or they might give what the editor's interpretation of the image is. It also might give metadata like copyright information or the work's title, anything like that. So they're doing different tasks, and they're also encoded differently. You can have both alt text and a figure caption. Alt text is going to go into the text node of the desk element, whereas image captions go into a fig desk element. And again, I'll show you what that actually looks like in our encoding in a minute in our XML. Oops, clicked the wrong thing. There are a few key principles that LEMDO follows when we write our alt text. The first one is accessibility. So does my alt text communicate key components of the image? Is there anything significant that a viewer of an image would get out of it that a reader isn't going to get out of my alt text? That's number one. Is it accurate? Is it accessible? We're also looking for honesty. So does my alt text truthfully describe what's in the image? We're not making things up, we're just saying what's there. Finally, clarity is our third key principle. Does my alt text include subjective terms, like describing someone as pretty or happy? Or is it using objective terms, such as characteristics, using a wheelchair or smiling? We want to be using those objective terms rather than subjective ones. When it comes to our actual practice, we're going to follow these steps. The first thing is we're going to capture important elements of the image. If something is important to the overall meaning or the argument that you want to make about that image, describe it. I often think of the question, to what end am I including this image? There's probably a reason you've put it in your edition. You want to make sure that reason is kept in your description. In the LEMDO environment, the important things are often the medium. Is it a woodcut? Is it an infographic? Is it a production photo? The main subject of the image, important imagery, and sometimes background. When we have humans as our main subjects of images, we try to include the race where possible. The lucky thing about our project is we often know who is in an image, and so we can find out that information with a quick internet search. So we can use accurate and respectful language. Next, we're going to ensure that we're using objective language. The one that I often see come up is emotion. So in this image I have on the screen right now, we might describe this as a Black girl who is smiling and doing a fist pump, rather than saying that she is happy or proud or excited. If we do our job correctly, people accessing our alt text are going to be able to interpret that body language for themselves. We want to empower people to make those decisions rather than just telling people. We're then going to make sure that we're being concise. Alt text isn't the place to be really verbose and flowery. It's the place to be direct and brief. A fair guideline is under 125 characters. The reason being that old screen readers would just stop reading after about that long. Not great. Modern technology doesn't tend to do that as much, but there are still some screen readers that will continue reading after saying that there's a new image. So it will be like there's two images and the alt text just continues through both of them, which is a little bit funky. So we be concise to avoid that problem. When possible, we're going to encode our text as text and our images as images. Sometimes, though, that isn't possible. Think about our facsimiles of early modern playbooks. The text is one of the important parts of the image. The mise en page is another important part. We don't get that if we don't have an image or that facsimile. So when we do have an image with text in it, we're going to transcribe it. We don't use quotation marks because that can cause problems with processing. Instead, we'll put text reads and then a colon. So I've given an example here. The image has the lorem ipsum text, and I give text reads, lorem ipsum, and so on. If we have old spelling text, which of course we're going to come across, we'll have that image and we'll modernize the text, and we'll just say modernized text reads, because that's going to make it a lot easier for a screen reader to pronounce and a person listening to it to understand what's happening on the page. Now, naturally, these might go over 125 characters. That's okay. And let's look at an example. I'm going to put an image on screen that was used in James Murdoch's Henry V. We have this little image. It's kind of a brain teaser. It looks like a duck. It also looks like a rabbit. It was a fun description to write. And this is what it looks like in Oxygen, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. So this is what our encoding looks like. We have a figure element, which is what we always use for our images. And then our graphic element as the first child of this. It contains the URL to the image, and then our typical information. What type of image is it? How wide is it? How tall is it? And you'll see that it's self-closing, but I'm actually going to change that because our alt text is going to go into a desk element that's a child of graphic. Now you can choose if you want to add a resp attribute or not to give yourself responsibility and credit over this alt text. If you do, you just put pers and then your XML ID as the value. And you'll put your description, your alt text, right in the text node. So this is the text that I wrote for this image, a sketch of an animal that appears to be a duck from one angle and a rabbit from another. And that's it. You close your desk element, you close your graphic element, and then you can choose if you want to add an image caption or not. If you do, it goes into the fig desk element. And then all of that is wrapped up in that figure. And that's a fairly standard, what a full image encoding would look like. And this is what's going to be taken as alt text on the website. All right, so I'll very quickly recap what we've just gone over because it was a fair bit of information to take in. The first thing we talked about was positionality, and I feel like we're going way back in our minds now to go back to the start of this presentation. But we talked about it being a relational, shifting, and intersectional way that we fit into a space. We also mentioned that you have power as an editor or encoder in our LEMDO context because you get to decide what belongs in an edition and how it's made accessible through your encoding. We then looked at some student needs and how editing for a class rather than a student can help us take a more intersectional and inclusive approach. We went a bit more in depth into the needs of our disabled readers, particularly the need for editions to function with adaptive technology like screen readers and keyboards. We looked at LEMDO's role in making it an accessible edition, which is making sure that our HTML is accessible and continues to be accessible. And we also looked at how our site design and features that were worked on by our programmer, Martin, and our designer, Pat, how those features and design have made our site more accessible. Finally, we talked about your role as editors and encoders. The key thing that I hope you take away today is that considering your positionality as you're beginning your editorial process lets you examine where you might have gaps in what you've included in your edition. We also talked specifically about how you can improve accessibility for people who use screen readers by writing alt text to describe images. And you learned that LEMDO follows guiding principles of accessibility, honesty, and clarity when we write alt text. I also have a few resources that you can go back to. The first is our LEMDO documentation. I sent out the slides this morning, so hopefully you have this link. It's write alternate text for images, and it has a bit more detail. You'll see on this link, if you go to the website, there's a big watermark that says unpublished draft. That's because when we published LEMDO beta, when we had that release, it was still going under review. I've since updated it a little bit and gotten rid of that watermark. You'll see that in the next LEMDO beta release, or if you have access to our development site, you'll see that on there now. There are also a few external resources I mentioned. I did mention Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, if you're interested in origins of intersectional theory and critical race theory. It's a fun one to go back to. And I've also put a link to Prince Hamlet by Why Not Theater. I'll say some quick thank yous to Shirk for funding our webinars. A shout out to myself for designing our slides. Martin Holmes, our programmer who has done our TEI customization, and HCMC for site design and hosting. I'm also going to give a quick thank you to Shayun, who's been working on video transcription. We're putting all of these on YouTube with accurate closed captions. So Shayun's making sure that that happens for us.